We begin in the name of the God whose mercy is profound, whose kindness is forever. Why Islam? I have been talking about the sources of Islamic learning in the last few presentations. I mentioned in the very last presentation that Sunnah, like the Quran, is completely reliable because it satisfies the criteria of both ijma, consensus, and tawatur, uninterrupted continuity. If Sunnah, the religious practices of the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, is a source which is completely authentic, then what exactly is Hadith? That's what I'm going to talk about in this presentation. Hadith is a claim that the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, said or did, or something happened in his presence and he did not criticize it. This claim is supported by the evidence of those people who were involved in transmitting, narrating this information. So there are people who are mentioned along with the actual subject content of Hadith. Hadith, therefore, is comprised of two components. There is this matan, which is the text, the message, and the chain of narrators who are called isnad, ruwat. There are narrators who are ravis, and this support that is provided to the claim that this is what the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, said. Where do we get Hadith from? Well, now we get Hadith from the books of Hadith. These books are the ones, most of which appeared in the 3rd century Hijrah. That is 200 plus years after the demise of the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him. The people who compiled these Hadith were the ones who investigated their veracity, reliability to the best of their abilities. There are many books of Hadith, but the most prominent amongst them are two: the Hadith book of Bukhari and the book compiled by Muslim, Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. These books, they appeared in the close to the middle of 3rd century Hijrah. So they are distanced from the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, by something like 2.5 centuries. There are other books of Hadith as well, which are considered to be reliable, 4 of them at least, which together with these two are called Sihah Sitta, the 6 reliable books of Hadith. In order for the Hadith to be verified, there are 2 criteria. One is the criterion of riwayat. That is, investigators investigate. They try to find out whether the people who form the chain of narrators, starting from the companion who narrated the story, the statement of the Prophet, followed by the one who came in the next generation, and so on, till the muhaddith, the compiler of Hadith book, who heard from the last of the narrators. And these chain of narrators is then investigated. Their honesty, their reliability, their memory, their knowledge, etc. And then a judgment is passed as to whether all these people who were involved in the process of transmitting Hadith, were they reliable or not. If a scholar, a muhaddith, believed that they were reliable, he would declare that the Hadith is reliable. But there is another criterion which is employed by many scholars, which is called the criterion of darayat. They would look at the Hadith contents and would find out, make an opinion as to whether it seems to be consistent with the Quran, with Sunnah, with hadith, other ahadith, and common sense or not. So they take their decision as to whether it should be considered as a reliable piece of information for religious purposes or not. So one should not be surprised that there are differences of opinion regarding whether a certain hadith is to be accepted or not. There is a large database of names called sometimes asma of the people who in the 200 plus years were responsible at one stage of the hadith transmittance or another. These people are the ones who are the support system, are the ones who provide the evidence as to whether a certain statement attributed to the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, is to be considered reliable or not. What are the religious contents of hadith? There are three important areas of religious significance wherein we find a hadith relevant to them. One is what is described as ilmun nabi, the knowledge provided by the Prophet, knowledge outside the Quran. Obviously, the Quran was given to us by the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, but there was some other important information that he provided us with, which we find in the hadith literature. Like, for example, some of the significant signs that people would see before the arrival of the Day of Judgment, etc. The other category of information that we find in hadith relevant to religion, religious purposes, is what can be described as fiqhun nabi, the jurisprudence of the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, which is explaining what is mentioned in the Quran. That is, the Quran is clear in what it says, but at times leaves some understanding to be explained by the individual who is reading it. What he does is there already in the text, but it needs deeper understanding, reflection. So we have quite a few instances wherein the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, clarified what was there in the Quran but not clearly mentioned. Sometimes the Quran leaves some information, some understanding to be reached by the reader himself. And the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, provided us with the information that would enable us to understand the Quran more in the category of fiqhun nabi. Then we have another category, which is siratun nabi. That is the glorious example of the Prophet, the way he practiced religion, the way he prayed to God, the way he preached God's message, the way he showed his high morals, various different excellent examples of the Prophet's conduct, which is obviously worthy of being followed, emulated. And all this is what we find in hadith literature. So hadith is extremely useful as far as religious understanding and practice is concerned. However, there are challenges in understanding hadith. For example, sometimes we find that there is an apparent conflict between Quran and hadith. Obviously, there can be no conflict between what the Quran says and what the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, must have said. However, because there could be problems of understanding, problems that we find in the understanding of narrators, that we find that a message which the Prophet said got altered, modified, and therefore what we find sometimes in the book of Hadith, a mention which doesn't tally with the Quran. For example, it is said that Aisha, the wife of the Prophet, was approached by a companion who said that another companion has mentioned that the Prophet said that when a person passes away and there are ladies who are weeping, crying, it causes the one who has passed away to be in pain. Aisha, may God's mercy be on her, she said it's not possible because the Quran very clearly says, La taziru waziratum wizra ukhra. No bearer of burden is going to bear the burden of another person. How is it possible that ladies are crying on the death of somebody and the one who has passed away, he should be in pain because of their crying? And she clarified that the fact of the matter is that it so happened that a Jew died and his body was being taken away, the funeral procession, and there were ladies who were crying at home. And the Prophet said that while they are crying, he is being punished. In other words, if they are crying because he has died, probably the more important reason for them to cry was that he's been punished. So the understanding was not taken by the first narrator in the correct manner, and it was presented later to others in a way that it appeared contradicting or going against the Quran. Another problem that can happen is that sometimes we may find that there are two narrators of the same incident that is reported, and their information is different. A very glaring example of it is famous hadith which is called Hadith Jibreel, in which it is mentioned that angel Jibreel came to the Prophet while he was in the company of his companions, and he came in the form of a human, and he asked many questions, one of which was, when is the hereafter going to take place? In other words, what is going to be the time, at what stage the day of judgment is going to happen? And the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, responded by saying that neither you, the one asking, nor I know the answer of it. In other words, it's only God who knows about it. This particular narrative has been reported by two companions, Umar and Abu Huraira. While the narrative story reported by both is almost the same in its other details, at this stage when he answered that only God knows about it, the narrative of Abu Huraira goes on to say that it is one piece of information amongst five which only God knows and nobody else knows. And he recited the last verse of Surah Luqman, chapter 31, wherein it is said that it is God who knows when the hereafter is going to happen, and he causes rain to fall. He knows what is in the womb of mothers. Nobody knows what he is going to do the next day, and nobody knows where he is going to die. That is, these are five different important pieces of information which the narrative claimed only God knows and nobody else knows. Whereas the narrative of Umar is completely silent, thereby suggesting that the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, didn't say it. The trouble is that if you accept this narrative, then you will have to believe that when exactly does the rain fall, only God knows, and what is in the wombs of mothers, only God knows. We now know that in both cases, there is fairly accurate information that people can have as to when rain is going to fall and what is in the womb of mothers. So if we go by the Hadith narrative, we will get an information which would suggest that only God knows about these important areas of knowledge. But we know that there is a conflict between two narratives, and one of the mention of this story does not include this information. There could be a third problem in understanding Hadith, and that is, in some cases, there is no mention of the context. A statement is made which is very clear. It asserts that such and such things should be done, without clarifying as to whether it was meant for everyone or it had a certain context. A good example of it would be the example of Hadith that says that all those men whose trousers are lower than their ankles, the part that they cover from ankles onwards, is going to be consigned to the hellfire. When we read this hadith in Bukhari, the most reliable books, we also read another hadith immediately following it, which says those whose trousers are going to be lower than the ankles out of arrogance, they are the ones who are, that part of the ankles is going to be consigned to the hellfire. So the context, the clarification of arrogance is not mentioned in the earlier hadith, which has caused many Muslim men to have a dress that would always make sure that their ankles are uncovered. So there was this difficulty of context not getting clarified that caused this understanding to become widespread. What are the attitudes towards hadith? Well, there are at least three attitudes that we find amongst Muslims regarding hadith. There are people who believe that if a hadith is reliable, going by the understanding of reliability of the experts of hadith, then it is a part of religion, and therefore it ought to be followed as part of the message given to us by the messenger, may God's mercy be on him. There are others who believe that hadith has no role to play in religious understanding. We have the Quran, and that's about it. But there are those who believe that hadith, even though is neither Quran nor Sunnah, which are the two pillar sources of knowledge of Islam, it's nonetheless important in that it gives us information about the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him. There are problems and difficulties of reliability, but hadith should be seen strictly in the light of the Quran and Sunnah. Hadith, therefore, in the opinion of these scholars, is a footnote of the Quran and Sunnah. Its meanings should be understood in the light of what the Quran and Sunnah say. Finally, what is the difference between Sunnah and Hadith? There are two important differences. One, Sunnah is absolutely reliable because it is based on ijma, consensus of opinion of all companions, all first generation Muslims, and tawatur, uninterrupted transmittance, continuity of the process of the Sunnah being given to the next generations. Whereas Hadith has neither ijma, consensus, nor tawatur, uninterrupted continuity. Second, Sunnah is always a practice. Hadith carries information which is other than practice as well. All statements, all practices, and all other information which has to do with the times of the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, are to be found in books of Hadith.